Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our next lesson from the Unit 7 on natural selection. Today we're going to talk all kinds of natural selection, and I apologize if any of this seems hastily made, but I decided to go ahead and move on to making the next set of notes for you, so that way it wouldn't take too long. Before we get into natural selection, we're going to talk first about artificial selection. And the reason why we're talking about this is because many of the observations that Charles Darwin made in his, landmark book on the origin of species, where he laid out his principles of natural selection and how those led to evolution of species, a lot of those observations were first kind of made when he was looking at artificial selection, and that's humans breeding organisms for specific traits. So we've been doing this for thousands of years. For example, what you see here is teosinte, which is the original plant from which corn was first developed. So all the corn that we eat today originally came from this scraggly looking plant right here. What people did, as people in the Americas did, as they domesticated it, is they basically, you see these kind of little bumps right here, those are the kernels that were on the original teosinte plant. They're very tiny, there's not a ton of them. But over time, people chose and selected the varieties that had more kernels, and they would breed those with each other, or they would save seeds or save kernels from those and sow them the next year. And they kept doing that until finally we get to what we have as our modern corn, which is very big cob, a lot of kernels, so a lot of things to eat. And that's something that's been done with every single type of domesticated plant or animal. People have taken them and bred them for specific traits that humans have found beneficial. So if it's some sort of food plant, usually for a larger seed or a larger fruit, something that makes them easier for us to eat. For an animal, it could be if you are breeding dairy cattle, for example, choosing to breed the cows that produce the most milk. We've even bred, animals for not quite like necessary reasons. For example, there's a lot of different dog breeds out there. And so this is artificial selection because it is us as humans, not nature, selecting a specific trait and increasing the frequency of that trait from one generation to the next by doing this kind of selected breeding. It's responsible for a number of differences. So what you see on the left-hand side here is you see a bunch of different breeds of pigeon. And a lot of these breeds were created by people interbreeding pigeons to produce desired traits. This isn't even all of the different kinds of pigeon breeds that there are. There are some really fancy, fluffy ones with some really interesting feather stuff going on. But they're all basically developed from this guy, a common carrier, a common pigeon like you see on the street. Then there's what happened with the gray wolf. So the gray wolf was the ancestor of all domesticated dogs. And as people selected for specific traits, that modified the appearance of these dogs. So here you see different breeds as developed in different parts of the world. And these different breeds were bred for different things. So, for example, anything that's kind of small and maybe low to the ground may have been bred to hunt in burrows or things like that. You have like terriers, rat terriers, they're bred for catching rats. You've got all these shepherd dog varieties that were bred to help with shepherding sheep and any other herd animals. And so now we have these hundreds of different varieties of dog, all coming from this original gray wolf ancestor, as we bred different, populations of dogs for different traits. It would help if this would go forward. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about natural selection. So what happens when we're looking at what nature is doing instead of what humans are doing? So this was Darwin's entire explanation for how species change over time. On the origin of species, The Origin of Species was his book that he published that laid all of this out. And in this, he shared that his hypothesis that all these divergent species that you find around the world share a common ancestor. So what you see in them, if you trace their descendants, there is what's called descent with modification. Organisms come from other organisms, but they're modified over time, and that's because they are adapting to their environment through natural selection. So natural selection is the major mechanism by which evolution happens. That's why also this unit isn't called evolution, it's called natural selection, because natural selection is pretty key. So how does this happen? Well, the mechanism of natural selection is based on these assumptions. Organisms will overproduce offspring. They will have more offspring that their environment can possibly support. And within these groups of offspring that they have, they'll see some genetic variation. So not every single offspring is identical, and that's a good thing. The genetic variation is healthy for a population. So here you see a fish spawning and two different possible populations that could come from that one fish. The small population, population 1, and the large population, population 2. Obviously, if you have more organisms who eat the same food source, use the same resources, or share the same niche, they're going to compete with each other more. And so population 2 is likely going to experience a much greater competition or struggle for survival. All right. Next, resources in an environment are limited. So there is in any given environment only so much food, only so much water, or only so many places for shelter, only so many mates, which means that since you've got more organisms than an environment can support, not every organism is going to get enough resources to survive. And so I put this picture together, and I did it to illustrate a couple of points. So here we have a limited supply of food, some apples. And we've got what will be interspecific competition, which is between two different species. So these bears and these gorillas would both be interested in that same food source. And then we're going to have intraspecific competition, which is within a specific species. So each of those gorillas will be competing with each other for food, and each of those bears would be competing with each other for food. And there is not enough food there to support all of the organisms on here. So some organisms will get less food, and that will make them less likely to survive and or pass on their genes. So because of this limited resources and overproduction of offspring, you're going to have competition for those limited resources. And those organisms whose traits allow them to better either get resources, survive to reproductive age, produce offspring, or raise those offspring to maturity, any beneficial traits are going to help the organism who has them to survive. Any less beneficial traits or any harmful traits will decrease the organism's chance of survival or decrease the chances that they'll produce offspring. So it's not that we are designing traits for a specific environment. It's just there's variation. Not everybody's identical, and some people are going to do better in one environment versus another. Or some organisms will do better. This results in differential reproductive success. So in any given population, since you have genetic variation, some organisms with the most beneficial traits will survive to reproduce and have more offspring, and those with less beneficial traits will not survive and will likely die either before they produce offspring or just won't produce as many. So here we have kind of a picture of, we've got a leaf canopy, and there's two varieties of caterpillars there. One of them is mostly green and the other is kind of an orange and red. And if you are a predatory bird or a predator of this caterpillar, which of those caterpillars will be easier to pick out and find and eat? Well, it's obviously going to be the one that stands out the most. So notice here, we've got a red and orange caterpillar. That would probably be easier to spot, so it would get eaten. Here, we've got a green caterpillar, and so it would likely be harder to spot, and so it would more likely survive. So we've got genetic variation. We've got two different variants of color for this caterpillar, and then we've got differential reproductive success because we can figure that if there is a predator of these caterpillars, chances are good that these orange and red caterpillars are not going to survive. So that is the trait that organisms have affecting their survival, which means that these caterpillars, once they grow up and become butterflies, well, the ones that were green caterpillars will likely survive and pass on their genes. So we can take this differential reproductive success and we can use it to measure the fitness of an organism. So in the context of evolution, your fitness is measured by your reproductive success. So we have this diagram here with two different birds. One of them has only 4 grandchildren. The other has what looks like 16 grandchildren. The one with more descendants is going to be the one with greater reproductive success and therefore is going to have higher fitness. So we say evolution is survival of the fittest. And in this case, fittest is those who are able to pass on their genes the most efficiently. And so they're going to end up having their genes and more of the population as each generation passes. And then this favored trait that ends up giving an advantage of an environment can become more common in the population. We can call this an adaptation. An adaptation has 2 meanings. It can either be that favored trait or it can be the process of producing that trait. So here we see 3 different adaptations. On the far left, what you're seeing is a snake that is camouflaged. So here you see a physical adaptation. You see this snake right here hiding, so that way it would be a little harder to spot it, so that way it can catch prey. In the middle, what you see is a cactus type plant. It is modified so that way it can retain water as much as possible. It's also got these spikes sticking out of it, and those spikes serve as a defense because animals know these cacti have water and they would try to eat them. But the plant obviously doesn't want to get its flesh eaten. It's worked hard to save up that water, so it's got spiky, spiny defenses to try and protect itself. And then on the far right, you see here a bear. This is a bear that's hibernating, and that's a behavioral adaptation. Resources are scarce in the winter, so bears that can hibernate and kind of go into this state of reduced energy usage, reduced metabolism during the winter can survive, so that way in the spring they can pass on their genes. So selection, or the process of selection, can favor different traits and can lead to different outcomes over several generations. So positive selection is selection towards a trait. Negative selection is selection against a trait. And here, what we see is an original population with kind of this gradation of different phenotypes. So it goes from light fur color all the way to dark fur color. And then you see this mapping of the frequency of individuals. That is what percentage of the population has that phenotype. And what you see is that in the original population, you've got this kind of bell curve where most of the individuals have this intermediate phenotype, a very few are very dark, and a very few are very light. Depending on the environmental conditions, you could have what's called stabilizing selection, which, notice this dashed line shows our original population. In the population that's evolved several generations later, what you might see is that these outliers in phenotype are now a disadvantage. So you have less individuals with those extreme phenotypes, like the darker and lighter colors. Directional selection is where basically you push the population towards one end of this spectrum or another. So in this case, the average trait is getting darker and you have less of these light organisms. And then you have what's called disruptive selection, which is that the intermediate phenotypes are now a disadvantage, and now you're going to have light mice and dark mice, but nothing in between. So if we look at this, these are the 3 different types of natural selection that we can have in a population, and we're going to look at each of these individually. So I'm going to move on. You can pause this if you need to read these. But stabilizing selection, which is also called purifying selection, is basically going to reduce variation. So you're going to not really change the average trait or the mean, but you are going to kind of stick closer to the actual population mean. This is something that you see in human birth weight, for example. So this is a histogram showing you, birth weight of different individuals. So the percent of population that has, various birth weights. So like around 20% of the population is just a hair under 7 pounds. And the reason why we see this distribution is because of this right here. The line graph is showing you percent mortality. And basically, the babies who are around this average weight or this optimal birth weight are going to be the ones that survive the best. Because if a baby is too big, so if it's like 11 pounds, it's hard to have that baby be born without medical intervention. There's a higher risk of the baby getting stuck in the birth canal or, being a disadvantage for its mother's fitness because the mother may not survive the childbirth. Then if you are very low birth weight without medical intervention, it's hard to survive because you don't have enough mass to really keep yourself warm. And so babies, they'll lose a lot of body heat. And if you're too small and you can't maintain your body heat, also if you're too small because you haven't developed to term, then it's going to be harder for you to survive. So before medical intervention, there was a very high, very strong negative selection against large babies or small babies, and a very high positive selection for those medium weight, mean birth weight babies. Directional or disruptive selection is when you're basically trying to shift towards one extreme of a trait. So this is something that we've done artificially, for example, with longhorn cattle. Longhorn cattle were bred by people. Why? I'm not 100% sure. But they were bred basically to have the longest horns possible. So out of any particular generation, the bulls with the largest horns were the ones that were allowed to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. And over time, if you graphed the average length of the horns, it would have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So I guess not just bulls. That looks like it might be a cow. I don't know. All right. Then disruptive selection. This is where an intermediate trait is going to be negatively selected against. It's going to be a disadvantage. So here's an example. This is a type of bird called a black-bellied seed cracker. And in this bird, if you have a smaller width of your beak, then you're going to be able to survive. If you are going to have a larger width of your beak, you're going to survive. But if you have an intermediate width beak, you're not going to survive. So these are like data that have actually been collected in some places, looking at the effect of environment on the selection of these traits. And what happened is, in this environment, if you had very small beak size, you were able to eat very small seeds. If you had a very wide beak size, you were able to eat wide seeds. But if your beak size was intermediate, it was harder for you to get to the small seeds and your beak wasn't big enough to eat the big seeds. And so any organisms, any of these birds that had the medium beak size would end up dying off. So the only traits that would get passed down would be small beak size or large beak size. This can make what we call a bimodal distribution. Basically, it's got two peaks. And this is where the extremes of a distribution of phenotypes is going to be favored. So going back to the root of natural selection, it's all about genetic variation. Genetic variation is the healthiest thing you can have in a population. So up here, what we're seeing in this picture is genetic variation in a population of rabbits. You can have the brown coloring, you can have the white coloring. This is a simplified example, but notice that by having multiple variants, you can have these rabbits have an advantage in different environments. So the brown rabbit has an advantage in environments that are kind of more grassy, more temperate, and the white rabbit has a disadvantage there because it stands out, and then the white rabbit has an advantage in snowy environments. You can see this in like the distribution of some species where like polar bears, for example, are all white to camouflage in the snow. Brown bears, grizzly bears are much darker to camouflage in forest. And if you have polar bears trying to live in the forest, they would stick out more and have a harder time hunting. If you had grizzly bears out on the ice trying to hunt, they would have a disadvantage because they wouldn't camouflage. So, random mutations are what create genetic variation. Remember, there is no purposeful mutation. Mutation is something your cells try to avoid because usually it's going to result in something bad. Cancer, non-functional proteins, something like that. But some mutations slip through your DNA repair processes, and those that are not like extremely harmful from the beginning, that don't just kind of wipe out whoever has them, those mutations can stick around in the population, and they create these different phenotypes, and they create variation. So if a mutation is neutral or it's beneficial, it can stick around. If it's harmful, it's more likely for it to disappear, but it's not guaranteed. And then some of these variations are going to either significantly increase or significantly decrease fitness depending on what environment you're in. So, for example, in this picture, that white bunny on the white background of the snow, that white phenotype for their fur is going to increase their fitness in that environment. On the other hand, it decreases their fitness in an environment without snow, as you can see in the middle picture. So natural selection acts on this random genetic variation. So it's not like evolution or natural selection or changes in the environment create new traits. They act on whatever traits are already in existence in the population. So if we look here, you probably heard the story of peppered moths. So peppered moths naturally like to live on trees with this kind of texture. They usually have lichen growing on them, and they have light colored bark. So the kind of speckled pattern that peppered moths usually have helps them camouflage very well. Well, back in like the 1800s, scientists started noticing in Great Britain. He noticed a mutant, a dark moth. Now, normally that dark moth would have a disadvantage because against that nice speckled light background, it would stand out and it would probably get eaten by predators. However, a change was happening in England at the time, and soot was being found on every surface. You'd go outside and you'd rub your hand on a building and it'd come away all sooty and dirty because they were burning a lot of coal during the Industrial Revolution. And so all of this soot began to blacken the trees in the area. And what they saw is that the trait that used to be beneficial, the trait of being peppered, of having that black and white speckling, became a disadvantage. And now that mutation that probably showed up randomly here and there in the population, all of a sudden that mutation wasn't a disadvantage, it became an advantage. And so that trait that already existed was then able to increase the survival and reproductive success of those dark moths, and those dark moths were able to pass on their genes and become a larger part of the population. Within 50 years, most of the peppered moths in the area had that dark color because most of the white speckled moths got eaten and weren't able to pass on their genes. As time passed, they started to recognize how much pollution was getting put into the countryside and the air quality. And so London and England made a lot of efforts to decrease the amount of ash that was being released of soot, decrease their reliance on coal, and things got cleaner. Those trees stopped being covered with the layer of black soot, and they went back to their original kind of lighter colored shade. And at that point, there were still some light-colored moths in the population. They were just rare. Well, at that point, it became an advantage to be light-colored again, and so the black-colored moths that used to be a beneficial trait now started getting eaten, and that trait stopped getting passed on. So next, the speckled moths, the peppered moths, were the ones that would survive and have more reproductive success and be fitter in the environment and pass on their genes. None of this would have been possible if it weren't for the fact that this mutation for dark-colored moths had arisen. If that mutation wasn't present, there is always the possibility that due to that change in environment, all of those peppered moths, if they had all stayed white, so if there were no dark moths, After the Industrial Revolution, there would have been the possibility that all of those speckled moths would have gotten eaten, and then you wouldn't have speckled moths anymore. They could have gone extinct. Luckily, there was an existing mutation that was beneficial when the environment changed. So it's not purposeful, this development of mutations. And then a changing environment can act as a selective pressure or selective mechanism on a population, which is what we talked about here. So an environment can either be stable or it can fluctuate, change quite a bit. You have some places where the environment changes during different seasons. So for example, an area that might be covered in snow most of the winter, but have grass or forest land most of the summer. Or you can have an environment that's changing gradually over time, like the peppered moths did. So before the Industrial Revolution, it was, an advantage to be light colored, like this guy. After the Industrial Revolution, it was a disadvantage to be light colored, and instead it was an advantage to be dark colored, like this guy right here. And so from generation to generation, it turns out that the favorable trait, the beneficial trait, changed from one generation to the next based on the change in the environment. This is something you see also over more long term. So what we're looking at here are two individuals in the lineage that gave rise to horses. So these are like modern horses. And this guy is Hyracotherium. I know, quite a long word. But that is a species that is ancestral to modern horses. Way back in the day, when most of North America was covered in forest, the Hyracotherium lived in those forests. Notice it's got this kind of speckled pattern, which could help with camouflaging in the shadows. Looks very similar to what you'll see on some, like, baby fawns and stuff like that. It was smaller. It actually walked on 3 toes instead of just 1 toe. And it had a shorter neck. It mostly grazed on leaves and stuff like that. Maybe some bushes, but it wasn't exactly eating a lot of grass. It probably didn't have to run very fast. Why? Because if you run super fast in a forest and you can't change direction, you're eventually going to hit a tree. Over time, as the forest started to disappear and give rise to grassland, many modifications happened to those species, and the descendants of Hyracotherium became taller. Basically, the taller Hyracotherium offspring would survive and pass on their genes. So, over time, the average height of these organisms would get higher and higher with each generation. Also, it became more of an advantage to have smaller toes, except for that one big toe. And so eventually their 3-toedness, 2 of those toes got smaller and smaller until eventually they disappeared, and they're left with just 1 toe now. They have those long necks, which are really ideally adapted for leaning down to eat grass. And then they also have those long legs, which allow them to run quite a bit. Because on a grassland, being able to run is an advantage, especially if there's something that thinks you're tasty and might want to eat you. So if you're able to run very fast, you're able to get away from predators. So when the environment changed, the traits that were actually beneficial changed, and so the organism's population changed and adapted to fit the new environment. But this brings me to something. A population is a group of individuals of a single species that live and interbreed in a particular area at a particular time. So you can talk about, like, the caterpillar population of a tree, you can talk about the squirrel population of Oak Cliff, etc. Individual organisms do not evolve. So you don't have, like, this green caterpillar evolving into an orange caterpillar because that's useful. No, that's not how evolution works. That's not how natural selection works. Instead, you have from one generation to the next, you can have a possible change in the frequency of these traits. So you could have in one generation If it's mostly beneficial to have green caterpillars, that could be the majority of your population. Then you could go, 10 generations down the line, if being orange became an advantage, then that trait could spread through the population because all the green caterpillars' babies died. But the red caterpillars' babies survived. So that's kind of how it works. So that is it. Next, we're going to talk about evidence of common ancestry. That may be a slightly longer lesson. We shall see.